So my name is Martha Feldman, and the rest of our panel is Christine Beckman and Mark Ventresca. We have actually had a lot of fun talking together and thinking about what we want to say. We realized this morning that what we really should have done is videotape those conversations and just edited them, and because there were way more ideas than we can possibly put into this hour, and they came about in a very informal and fun kind of interactive way, which is not so much what's going to happen now. Although hopefully it'll be fun, and hopefully we'll have some interaction across the presentations. The three of us represent a kind of different angles on Jim March. Jim was my dissertation advisor from 1976 to 1983. Christine knew Jim as both an undergraduate and a PhD student. Both of us were at, all of this knowing was at Stanford, so post-UCI. And I didn't put down the dates, but
more recently,
much more recently. We both acknowledge that we've known Jim more than half of our lives, but for different reasons. Christine got to know him at very early, since she was there as an undergrad. And Mark Ventresca identified himself as an admirer, who I think has had a lot of conversations, as all of us have, a lot of conversations over the years with Jim. Christine is currently at UCI, and Mark is currently at Oxford, and I'm currently at UCI. So I think that's set enough for introductions. So I was thinking, and one comment that we almost put another word at the end of our teacher, scholar, mentor, and that word was conundrum. And you'll hopefully see why. So when I was thinking about this, my eye happened to glance on a word cloud that one of my students has made for me by taking all of the comments that I put on her on various versions of her dissertation and making them into a word cloud, and then making them appreciative by turning them into a leaf, which was very good for her. Some of those questions are, how do you know? What does this mean? What is the story here? How can you tell? What new questions do you see? And as I was thinking about this and thinking about Jim March as a teacher, I realized, and as a mentor, these are questions I learned to ask by being asked them year after year after year, and gradually learning to at least approximate an answer. So I thought it was an appropriate kind of background for thinking about Jim March, the teacher, the scholar, and the mentor. As a teacher, Jim just let out a really big sigh here. As a teacher, Jim taught us things. There were plenty of things that we learned, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Christine's going to talk more, and Mark, I think, even more about some of the things that we learned from Jim. But I wanted to start by saying I think he, more than teaching us what to think, he taught us how to think. And that's the purpose of all those questions. He was a great one for nurturing hunches, and for rolling with whatever it is that you came up with, or sometimes what he came up with, and thinking about, okay, how can we work this? How can we work this idea? And learning how to work that idea was critical to working with Jim March. But he also taught, and in the process of doing that, he taught that theories aren't kind of frameworks, and if I'd had more ability here, I would have put a grid. Some people think of theories as a grid that you stick on top of the world, and you see what sticks up in which box. That was not the way, and sometimes when I find this when I'm talking, when I'm on a committee, and sometimes I say, well, what are your theories, or how are you going to theorize this? And people think, oh no, we don't want to, we want to know what was actually going on. We don't want to theorize it. And I'm like, yeah, but that's how we use theories. And that's another thing that we learned from Jim, is that theories are lenses. So instead of the grid, imagine a microscope or a magnifying glass or a camera. And that lens is not just a way to see, but it's also a way to ask questions. And that's what you're supposed to do with theories. And really, the more theories you know, the better. Because the more theories you know, the more questions you can ask. So it isn't just about learning one theory and staying in that theory and dividing the whole world into things that are in that theory. And finally, I think, and here's the problem of coming up with 3 things is always going to be inadequate. But these are my top 3. He taught that the world is really, really complex or messy, and that our job as scholars is not to get rid of that mess, not to get rid of the complexity, but to engage it deeply, and to engage the tension between complexity and theorizing. And that was the job. We could take it or not, but that's the job. Christine's going to talk about this in terms of dualities. That's just one of the many dualities that you learn to deal with as a student of Jim March. That you need to both abstract and stay connected with that deeply complex empirical reality. And that's very much consistent with what he does as a scholar as well, or what he is as a scholar as well. Again, I'm going to focus on 2 ideas that certainly are fundamental to my work, fundamental to a lot of people's work. Not the only great ideas that Jim March had, but 2 that were really fundamental. And one of those is that the way that the world is way too complex to be explained by rational choice theory. So that was kind of the starting point with his work with Herb Simon and Dick Sayert, and later with the garbage can theory with Michael Cohen and Johan Olsen. That we need different ways of understanding all this complexity. In terms of decision making, people are not just maximizing utility, or even not necessarily maximizing utility. That there are a lot of other things going on. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The other big idea that has informed a lot of other research is that organizational processes are the link between complexity and outcomes. So that the things we do in organizations are something that we really need to pay attention to, because they're doing a lot of work. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more. So bounded rationality was one of the phrases that a lot of you undoubtedly know from that early work on deconstructing the rational model. Bounded rationality, again, says that rational choice models actually require way too much information processing, and that we don't really do that, or we can't really do that, and that nonetheless we do actually make decisions. And some of those decisions are pretty darn good. And part of the way that we do that is through satisficing. So we get enough information to make a good enough decision. And that's one of the things that Mark's going to pick up on is with this kind of pragmatist orientation, is that we are doing things in the world. And we're not just doing them willy-nilly, but we're also not necessarily following that very strict rational choice model. But it isn't just that there's too much information processing going on, or too much information processing that we need to do. It's also that there are questions that we actually can't resolve. So there is conflict. People have different values. There is something that, a word that Jim used a lot was ambiguity. There's a lot of ambiguity in the world. And ambiguity isn't the same as uncertainty. Uncertainty can be resolved, even if it requires a lot of information to do it. Ambiguity, you're never going to resolve it. You're going to live with it. It comes from different people having different perspectives. One of my favorite examples is take the weather. The weather tomorrow is uncertain, except it's uncovered. But it will be resolved. We will have that information. Whether the weather is going to be good weather or bad weather, the weather forecasters here often proclaim that it's going to be great weather when it's going to be when we're going to have Santa Anas and it's blue sky and it's really hot. And I was like, that's not the weather I like because my sinuses get too dried out, right? Whether it's going to be good weather depends on what you want it for. Do you want to go to the beach? Do you want to not use the air conditioning? These are things that different people are going to come out differently. You're going to come out differently on these at different times. At different times of the day, at different times of your life. That's just a very small taste of what creates ambiguity. And ambiguity is something we live with all the time, and yet we still make decisions and we still take action. So that's, and that's an important underpinning of what it is that Jim's work helped us to see about organizations. And helped us to theorize. One of the ways we theorized this was by thinking about organizational processes, and one of the theories that he's famous for is the garbage can theory of decision making, which was one of the theories that came out of the Irvine experience, if I remember correctly. And part of what the garbage can theory does is focus on the organizational processes that allow us to make decisions. So we may not be able to resolve all that conflict we have in those, but we can have a meeting. We can have a process for making choices. We can vote. We can have a committee. We can have subcommittees. Or we can have lots of different organizational processes that allow us to make these decisions. So process was important, and one of the fundamental, one of the things Jim's best known for in terms of theories is the behavioral theory of the firm. I was at a fest trip for Jim years ago in Italy, and a CEO from a major corporation pronounced that the behavioral theory of the firm was the last great contribution to organization theory. So it was appreciative, except he didn't quite appreciate how much that had, as I'll talk about in a minute, how many great ideas that spawned. Central to the behavioral theory of the firm is the notion that organizational process is something that is what gets us between the complexities of the world, both inside the organization and outside the organization, and our organizational outcomes. So just a quick, I don't know how much I have Good, I'm good, okay, good. So just a kind of quick example, the behavioral theory of the firm starts with the idea of pricing. Well, pricing, until the behavioral theory of the firm, was thought to be something that markets did, right? Markets set prices. Well, it turns out, actually, markets don't set prices. Markets are relevant to prices, but people have to set prices, and people, mostly in organizations, mostly doing organizational work, are the ones who are setting prices. As a contemporary example, something that was in the news last night, very similar to price setting, is wage setting. So wage setting is a lot about, is Walmart going to be an organization that, where most of its employees are on welfare? Or is it going to be more like IKEA that has now set its standard as whatever the wage is, it should make it so that people can work here and not be on welfare? But what kind of organization are we going to be? How are we going to be that kind of organization? What kind of organization, what kind of choices can we make and changes can we make that we will still be successful? There's an enormous amount of external ambiguity and internal ambiguity. And what the behavioral theory of the firm says is most of that ambiguity is handled through various organizational processes that get us willy-nilly to something that the organization does. And that often, that willy-nilly ends up to be something that is quite reasonable and sensible. So that brings me to Jim March as the mentor. This is probably the part that's going to make Jim most uncomfortable, since it shows Jim as the sun in the center of our little universe. This is just, and again, this is just a small swipe of time from kind of the 1970 to 85, and I'm sure I've left some people out, and I'm sure I've left some ideas out. But the basic point is here, from Jim March and bounded rationality and the behavioral theory of the firm and the garbage can theory, several of us, I have, let's see, is this I have Dan Leventhal up in the corner, Ann Miner, Michael Cohen, and myself, with a satellite out there, Klaus Rierup, who has, the four of us were all Jim March students, and during that period, and Klaus Rierup has been mentored both by Dan Leventhal and me, and by Jim as well, and kind of continues. He's the next generation, and there are many other people in that next generation. This is just an illustration. But I wanted you to see kind of, and there are lots more topics I could have put on here. But one of the things I wanted you to see is, one, how many topics there are that came out of this. This is not a man who said, you will continue what I have been doing, and you will do it exactly as I have been doing, and apply it to some other setting, so that we now know that the whole world is happening in the same way. This is a very generative kind of, Ann Miner worked with entrepreneurship and idiosyncratic jobs was one of the phrases she used. She talked a lot about improvisation. Miner and Leventhal both focused a lot on organizational learning. Michael Cohen and I focused more on routines, which I think I left out somehow, and decision making. But I also wanted you to see, so Michael became very engaged with pragmatism and Dewey's work. I have become very engaged with practice theory and Giddens and Bourdieu, and that was encouraged to find our own ways of doing this work and to come up with our, so Michael's work on routines led to procedural memory, while mine led to endogenous change. and thinking about how things change just because you engage. And this is kind of the way that a legacy is created. Christine and Mark are both going to talk a lot more about not these particular ideas, but some of the legs that Jim March's ideas have had. And I just want to say thank you both to Jim